So in order to further develop my Murray-inspired drawings, I decided to later photocopy and paint them, as I wanted to further experiment with Murray's technique of applying thick layers of paint. So I began with mixing an array of bright colours and then distributing them so that the composition was quite scattered. So for example, there is a blue object towards the top half of the composition, and then there are blue swirls towards the bottom left of the composition and also the bottom right. And then I also decided to have the colour green scattered across the composition. So for example, on the left hand side towards the top middle and the right hand side. I decided to do this because I wanted a composition that was very scattered and quite even, so that it would reflect the atmosphere of Murray's work, because she normally has very large masses of solid colour in certain parts of her piece, and then contrast that with a colour that is on the opposite end of the spectrum. So I wanted to mimic the way in which she structures her colour palette. Again with this, rather than spending too much time on this piece, I decided to purposefully use very thick layers of acrylic paint. So I just used one layer of acrylic paint rather than waiting for it to dry and then applying another layer, etc. And I felt that this did work very well for me, because it reminded me of when I was a child and I used to just paint during nursery time, and you just wouldn't care about whether the surface was completely flat, and you wouldn't care about going outside of the lines, and you wouldn't care about the colours smudging or anything like that. So it was nice and quite nostalgic for me to be able to go back to that process of when I was a child. And I also feel like this is really appropriate for the whole concept behind my work, because I am, after all, still looking at child psychology with serial killers. So I definitely feel that by using the process that a child would to paint, it definitely aided me in understanding how important child upbringing is in terms of turning somebody into a psychopath or a serial killer. So with the second piece, I decided to look at my first piece and think, perhaps how could I structure it so that it mimics Murray's style even more so, because I really wanted to grasp the whole atmosphere behind her work, because I just was so inspired when seeing it at the MoMA, because I'd never seen such an abstract and colourful and interestingly vivid piece before, and especially on such a large scale. So I decided to look at the first piece, and I observed that I was still being quite careful with how much paint I was distributing onto one certain object. So for example, the pink object in the centre of the first piece is still very flat, in contrast to the red object that is below, because you can see the way in which the light hits it. You can see all of the different divots that the paintbrush has created, because I've used such a thick layer of paint, and I wanted that texture throughout the entire piece rather than just certain aspects. So when making my second piece, I decided to purposefully use an absurd amount of acrylic paint, because I really wanted to grasp Murray's technique of thick, gloopy layers of paint. So when preparing for this, I purposefully squirted out quite a lot of acrylic paint, because I hate being wasteful. So for me, in order to avoid being wasteful, I decided to purposefully use a lot of paint so that I would be more inclined to continually use a lot of paint, as to not waste anything and to simultaneously mimic Murray's technique of using chunky layers of paint. I also found that with this piece, because I was so much more carefree than when I was with painting the first piece, it produced something that was much more abstract and much more fluid and curvaceous. And I feel that this was definitely because I had loosened up with the first piece, and now I was definitely in the mindset to create something that was much more childlike and much more ambiguous. So with this second piece, this was also photocopied from my Murray-inspired drawings, because I just felt that it made sense for me to develop my drawings by adding texture and mediums onto it, rather than completely starting from scratch and starting a new piece, because it's less overwhelming when I take a piece that I've already done and think, how can I improve that, rather than starting completely fresh. I also found that by restricting myself with the timescale with the second piece, I achieved a much more laid back, chunkier texture, because with the first piece I was still quite focused on getting the surface very flat, whereas with the second one I allowed myself only several minutes to paint each object, which admittedly was quite stressful because I don't really like putting time constraints on myself, because I just find it really overwhelming. And although I am a very messy person, I still am really in the mindset of a perfectionist, so it was quite difficult for me to put myself in that process. But I had to purposefully put myself into the mind of a child and the way that they would paint something. And children, especially when they're young, they just do. They don't really think about anything, especially when drawing and painting. So I just felt really liberated in a way, that I was able to just apply thick layers of paint, wait for it to dry, and then just cut it out. And that was my piece. It was just something that was just so different for me, because in the past I had been so frustrated if a piece wasn't exactly how I'd envisioned it. But with this, it was just an appreciation for bright colours and the gloopy texture, rather than feeling like I have to have this perfect. And I just feel really liberated by replicating Murray's process, because it really has put me into that childlike mindset. Although I didn't decide to make my children's show in the end, I feel that Murray's process as a whole definitely inspired me so much in terms of my continual practice as my sketchbook has progressed and as my journey as an artist has progressed. Because before, I'd never really used acrylic that much, whereas with this is very solid, and so I feel that this definitely relates to my current practice of painting onto acetate, because first of all the medium is still the same, and also her colour palette of using bright vivid colours, as well as Becky Sloan and Joseph Pelling's use of vivid colours, have continually inspired me as my journey has progressed to use mainly primary colours within my work, because previously, especially during A-level, I was using very tonal and monochromatic colour palettes, and recently I've gone through quite a large style change, which has been quite difficult for me, because who I am as a person is still changing and altering, and I'm not 100% sure who I am, but that's completely fine, because I'm only 19 and I'm still discovering myself. So I feel that definitely being able to continually use a vivid colour palette and experiment with contrasting colours and complementary colours and primary colours, I've been able to find parts of myself, I would say, in the sense that I'm still able to experiment with who I am by experimenting with different colours, but also I'm still able to represent that darker part of myself that I don't perhaps show stylistically anymore, but it's still a part of me. So I'm combining my somewhat newfound love for colour with my love for dark themes, which I've always had.